In the silent desert of western Egypt, the fate of an entire continent hung in the balance, behind endless minefields and choking dust. Two exhausted armies prepared for a battle that neither could afford to lose. What unfolded at El Alamein was not a clash of speed or daring maneuvers, but a grinding contest of endurance, firepower and will that would change the course of the Second World War. For more than 2 years, North Africa had been the stage for a brutal war of movement. Across a vast and unforgiving landscape, armies clashed in a struggle defined by distance, scarcity, and endurance. The desert itself became an active participant in the conflict, shaping every decision made by commanders on both sides. From the shores of the Mediterranean to the deep interior of the Sahara, the battlefield stretched across thousands of miles. There were few natural landmarks, few permanent settlements, and almost no shelter from heat, wind, and sand. Operations were dictated not by terrain advantage, but by supply lines that stretched dangerously thin across hostile ground. In this environment, speed and initiative often mattered more than numerical strength. Columns of vehicles raced across open desert, seeking to outflank, encircle, or surprise the enemy. Yet every advance carried risk, as fuel shortages and mechanical failures could halt momentum without warning. Across vast deserts and along narrow coastal roads, Allied and Axis forces surged forward, retreated, regrouped, and struck again. Victories were rarely decisive, and defeats were seldom final. Each engagement ended not with destruction, but with withdrawal, reorganization, and preparation for the next clash. The war in North Africa unfolded as a continuous cycle of attack and counterattack. A breakthrough on one day could become a retreat on the next. Momentum shifted rapidly, often determined by logistics rather than tactics alone. Armored units spearheaded most offensives, relying on mobility and firepower to overwhelm defensive positions. Infantry followed behind, securing ground that tanks could not hold alone. Artillery and air support played critical roles, yet their effectiveness depended heavily on coordination and supply. The desert imposed harsh limits on all forms of warfare. Engines overheated under relentless sun, sand-clogged weapons, vehicles, and instruments. Water was rationed carefully, and exhaustion became a constant companion. Soldiers fought not only the enemy, but the environment itself. Long days under burning heat were followed by freezing nights beneath open skies. Sandstorms could erase visibility entirely, halting movement and disorienting entire formations. Despite these conditions, the campaign never slowed. Instead, it intensified as both sides committed increasing resources to the struggle. North Africa became a proving ground for modern mechanized warfare. The conflict drew in forces from across the globe. British, Australian, New Zealand, Indian, South African, and later American troops fought under the Allied banner. Opposing them were German and Italian formations sent to secure Axis ambitions in the Mediterranean and Middle East. Each side viewed the theater as strategically vital. Control of North Africa meant access to key sea routes, oil resources, and regional influence. A decisive victory could open the path towards southern Europe or the Middle East. Victory shifted, constantly, dictated as much by fuel and supply as by courage or command. An army could possess superior weapons and experienced leadership, yet still fail if its supply lines collapsed. In the desert, logistics were not a supporting function, but the foundation of all operations. Fuel determined how far armored units could advance. Ammunition dictated how long an offensive could be sustained. Food and water defined the limits of human endurance. Naval control of the Mediterranean played a decisive role in this struggle. Convoys crossing the sea were exposed to air and submarine attack. Losses at sea translated directly into shortages at the front. The Axis powers faced increasing difficulty supplying their forces. Ports were limited, routes were long and allied. Air and naval forces grew steadily stronger. Each sunken ship weakened the fighting capacity of frontline units. Allied supply, by contrast, improved over time. Industrial capacity expanded, and production increased steadily. By the later stages of the campaign, material superiority began to favor the Allies decisively. Command decisions were shaped by these realities. Generals planned operations based not only on enemy strength, but on fuel stocks and transport capacity. Opportunities were seized or abandoned according to what supply could sustain. The Desert War rewarded caution as much as boldness. Overextension often led to disaster. Armies that advanced too far risked being cut off from their lifelines. Yet hesitation carried its own dangers. A paused force could quickly become vulnerable to enemy maneuver. Commanders were forced to balance aggression with restraint under constant pressure. Morale rose and fell with each engagement. Success bred confidence, while defeat sowed doubt and fatigue. Units rotated in and out of the line, yet the strain never fully eased. For soldiers on the ground, the war was experienced in fragments. Moments of intense violence were followed by long periods of waiting. The horizon remained empty until suddenly it erupted with fire and movement. Armored battles unfolded at close range. Tank crews engaged each other across open ground, often within sight of their targets. Losses were immediate and unforgiving. Infantry faced a different ordeal. They advanced on foot through exposed terrain, often under artillery fire. Minefields posed constant danger, hidden beneath the sand. Air power added another dimension to the struggle. Aircraft searched for enemy columns, striking supply lines and concentrations of troops. Control of the skies shifted gradually but decisively toward the Allies. Despite technological advances, the campaign retained a raw and personal character. Men relied on discipline, endurance, and trust in their comrades. Survival often depended on experience rather than innovation. As months passed, patterns emerged. Axis forces achieved dramatic advances through speed and initiative. Allied forces absorbed these blows, regrouped, and returned with greater strength. Each side learned from failure. Tactics evolved, defenses deepened, and coordination improved. The desert became a classroom for modern warfare. By the middle of the conflict, both armies were hardened by experience. Illusions of quick victory faded. The campaign settled into a prolonged contest of attrition and will. The cost of the struggle mounted steadily. Equipment losses were heavy. Casualties accumulated across all nations involved. Yet neither side could afford to disengage. Too much had been invested in the outcome. Too much depended on control of this remote and hostile land. The war of movement in North Africa was not a single battle, but a continuous sequence of trials. Each engagement was shaped by what had come before. Every decision carried consequences that echoed across the desert. By the time forces converged at El Alamein, The campaign had already exacted a heavy toll. Men and machines were worn by months of fighting and marching. Supplies were stretched to their limits. What remained was not the exuberance of early offensives, but a grim determination. Both sides understood that the coming battle would be different. The desert no longer offered room to maneuver freely. The stage had been set by years of relentless movement. Now, that movement was about to end. The war in North Africa was approaching its decisive moment. The conflict began in September 1940, when Italy launched an invasion of Egypt. From neighboring Libya, the decision was driven by ambition rather than preparation, reflecting Italy's desire to assert itself as a great imperial power. Benito Mussolini envisioned rapid success, believing British resistance would be weak and easily overcome. Italian forces crossed the Libyan-Egyptian border with considerable numerical strength but limited operational readiness. Their army lacked sufficient transport, modern equipment, and effective coordination between units. Command structures were rigid, and logistical planning was inadequate for sustained desert operations. The invasion advanced cautiously along the coastal road toward the Egyptian frontier. Italian columns moved slowly, constrained by supply limitations and concern over British counterattacks. Instead of pressing forward decisively, Italian commanders halted repeatedly to consolidate their positions. By the time Italian forces reached Sidi Barrani, momentum had already been lost. Rather than continuing toward the Nile Delta, they established a series of fortified camps. These positions were intended to secure gains, but they also immobilized the invading force. The operation quickly faltered. Italian troops remained static in exposed positions, separated by wide gaps of open desert. Supply routes stretched back. Across Libya, vulnerable to disruption and delay. Morale declined as soldiers faced harsh desert conditions without clear direction. Water shortages, equipment failures, and inadequate shelter eroded combat effectiveness. The army that had entered Egypt with confidence now hesitated in uncertainty. British commanders observed these developments closely. Though outnumbered, they recognized the vulnerability created by Italian dispersion and immobility. Opportunity emerged not through superior numbers, but through superior planning and execution. British forces in Egypt were smaller but more flexible. They were better adapted to desert warfare, having trained extensively in mobile operations. Commanders emphasized initiative, coordination, and exploitation of enemy weakness. In December 1940, the British launched a counter-offensive. The operation was conceived as a limited strike rather than a full-scale campaign. Its objective was to disrupt Italian positions and restore the strategic balance. What followed exceeded all expectations. British units moved swiftly through the desert, bypassing fortified camps and attacking from unexpected directions. Italian defenses, designed to face frontal assault, collapsed under this maneuver. Entire Italian formations were isolated and overwhelmed. Supply lines were severed, and communication between units broke down rapidly. Surrender followed in large numbers as resistance became untenable. The British advance gained momentum with each success. Captured equipment and supplies sustained further movement. Italian attempts to regroup were repeatedly thwarted by rapid British action. By early 1941, British forces had pushed deep into Libyan territory. Key ports and airfields fell in quick succession. The scale of the Italian defeat shocked both Allies and Axis alike. Thousands of Italian soldiers were taken prisoner, Vast quantities of equipment were captured or destroyed. The illusion of Italian military strength in North Africa was shattered. This reversal alarmed Adolf Hitler, who dispatched German forces to stabilize the situation. Until this point, Germany had regarded North Africa as a secondary theater. Hitler's strategic focus remained fixed on Europe and the coming conflict with the Soviet Union. However, the collapse of Italian forces threatened broader Axis interests. Loss of North Africa would expose southern Europe to Allied pressure. Control of the Mediterranean balance was at risk. Reluctantly, Hitler agreed to intervene. The objective was not conquest, but stabilization. German forces were to prevent total collapse and restore Axis credibility. The deployment was initially limited in scope. Germany sent a small but highly mobile contingent. This force was intended as a defensive measure rather than an offensive spearhead. Its formation became known as the Afrika Korps. Despite its modest size, it was equipped with modern tanks, artillery, and experienced personnel. German doctrine emphasized flexibility, initiative, and combined arms cooperation. Leadership was central to the mission's success. The commander selected was a general with recent battlefield experience. His reputation had been forged in earlier campaigns, marked by speed and audacity. Their commander was Field Marshal Erwin Rommel. Rommel arrived in North Africa with clear intent and strong personal authority. He possessed a deep belief in offensive action as the key to victory. Rommel quickly assessed the situation upon arrival. He found Italian forces demoralized and disorganized. German units, though capable, were limited in number and supply. Rather than adopt a purely defensive posture, Rommel chose to act aggressively. He believed hesitation would invite further Allied advances. Speed and surprise became the foundation of his approach. German and Italian units were reorganized under his direction. Training emphasized coordination between tanks, infantry, and artillery. Commanders were encouraged to seize initiative at every opportunity. Rommel's leadership transformed the operational tempo of the campaign. Axis forces regained confidence and cohesion. British commanders were forced to reassess their assumptions. The intervention achieved its immediate objective. Axis collapse was halted. The campaign entered a new phase defined by maneuver and counter-maneuver. What had begun as an Italian gamble had drawn Germany into a prolonged struggle. North Africa was no longer a peripheral theater. It had become a critical front in the global conflict. The decisions made in those early months shaped everything that followed. Initial failure led to escalation rather than withdrawal. Each side committed more deeply to a war neither had planned to fight at such length. The invasion of Egypt and its collapse revealed the realities of modern warfare. Ambition without preparation proved disastrous. Adaptability and leadership emerged as decisive factors. From this moment onward, North Africa would witness a relentless contest. Advances would be met with counterattacks. Victory would remain elusive and temporary. The seeds of future battles were sown in these early reversals. The desert would soon see armies surge back and forth across the same ground. What began as a limited operation had expanded into a major theater of war. The stage was set for years of fighting. Commanders on both sides learned costly lessons. The conflict in North Africa had only just begun. Rommel transformed the campaign. Aggressive, mobile, and unpredictable, he drove Allied forces eastward in a series of bold offensives. The desert became synonymous with his name. Tobruk was besieged. British positions collapsed one after another. By mid-1942, Axis forces had captured Tobruk and advanced to within striking distance of Cairo. Only one position stood between Rommel and the Nile Valley. That position was El Alamein. El Alamein owed its importance not to size or population, but to geography. It lay on the narrow coastal strip of northern Egypt. Here, the open desert was constrained by natural barriers. To the north stretched the Mediterranean Sea. Its shoreline denied any possibility of maneuver around the flank. Naval movement offered no solution for land forces seeking to bypass defenses. To the south lay the Qattara Depression. This vast expanse of salt marsh, soft ground, and steep escarpments was impassable to mechanized forces. Attempts to cross it would have risked total destruction. Between sea and depression ran a corridor of desert barely wide enough for an army to operate. It was here that all movement east or west was forced to pass. The geography transformed the region into a natural bottleneck. For the first time in the North African campaign, maneuver was sharply limited. The freedom that had defined earlier fighting vanished. Any advance would have to confront prepared defenses head-on. El Alamein was not a fortress by design. It was a modest railway halt and collection of buildings. Yet its location gave it strategic weight far beyond its physical appearance. Whoever held El Alamein controlled the gateway to Egypt. Beyond it lay the Nile Delta, the heart of British power in the region. Cairo, Alexandria, and vital lines of communication depended on this defense. For the Axis, breaking through El Alamein offered immense reward. It promised access to the Nile Valley and the Suez Canal. Such a victory would have threatened Allied positions across the Middle East. Oil supplies, sea routes, and imperial connections all hung in the balance. The consequences extended far beyond the desert battlefield. Strategic calculations in London and Berlin reflected this reality. Rommel understood the significance of the position immediately. His earlier successes had been achieved through mobility and surprise. At El Alamein, those advantages were constrained by terrain. Yet Rommel also recognized opportunity. A decisive breakthrough here could end the campaign in his favor. Speed remained essential before Allied strength could fully recover. British commanders reached similar conclusions from the opposite perspective. They saw El Alamein as the last defensible line before catastrophe. Retreat beyond it would have opened Egypt to invasion. There would be no space for withdrawal. No secondary line offered comparable protection. Failure at El Alamein meant strategic disaster. As Axis forces approached, preparations intensified. Defensive positions were strengthened. Minefields were laid. Across likely avenues of approach, engineers worked relentlessly to shape the ground. Artillery positions were selected with care. Fields of fire were calculated to cover every approach. The British Eighth Army began transforming the corridor into a fortified zone. Depth replaced mobility as the central defensive principle. Time was used to prepare rather than maneuver. For soldiers arriving at El Alamein, the change was stark. The endless desert gave way to fixed lines and defined sectors. Movement was now governed by orders rather than opportunity. Rommel faced mounting challenges as he closed on the position. Supply lines stretched to their limits. Fuel shortages grew more severe with each mile advanced. Every additional day favored the defenders. Allied reinforcements continued to arrive. Material superiority slowly shifted. Despite this, Rommel pressed forward. He believed delay would prove fatal to Axis momentum. The gamble was characteristic of his command. Initial clashes revealed the nature of the new battlefield. Attacks met dense defensive fire. Progress came at high cost. The desert no longer rewarded bold thrusts alone. Preparation and coordination became decisive. Attrition replaced maneuver as the dominant form of combat. Both sides sensed the gravity of the moment. Veterans recognized that El Alamein was unlike previous engagements. The campaign had reached a turning point. Commanders adjusted their thinking. Expectations of rapid victory faded. The prospect of prolonged struggle loomed. For the Axis, El Alamein represented the final chance to exploit earlier gains. For the Allies, it was the line that must not be crossed. Neither side could afford failure. As forces assembled, tension mounted across the front. Patrols probed defensive lines. Artillery exchanges signaled the coming storm. The narrow corridor concentrated men and machines. Mistakes would have amplified consequences. Every decision carried strategic weight. In this confined space, the fate of the North African campaign would be decided. The Desert War had reached its limit. There would be no more room to maneuver. Only one position stood between Rommel and the Nile Valley. That position was El Alamein. El Alamein owed its importance not to size or population, but to geography. It lay on the narrow coastal strip of northern Egypt. Here, the open desert was constrained by natural barriers. To the north stretched the Mediterranean Sea. Its shoreline denied any possibility of maneuver around the flank. Naval movement offered no solution for land forces seeking to bypass defenses. To the south lay the Qattara Depression. This vast expanse of salt marsh, soft ground, and steep escarpments was impassable to mechanized forces. Attempts to cross it would have risked total destruction. Between sea and depression ran a corridor of desert barely wide enough for an army to operate. It was here that all movement, east or west, was forced to pass. The geography transformed the region into a natural bottleneck. For the first time in the North African campaign, maneuver was sharply limited. The freedom that had defined earlier fighting vanished. Any advance would have to confront prepared defenses head-on. El Alamein was not a fortress by design. It was a modest railway halt and collection of buildings, yet its location gave it strategic weight far beyond its physical appearance. Whoever held El Alamein controlled the gateway to Egypt. Beyond it lay the Nile Delta, the heart of British power in the region. Cairo, Alexandria, and vital lines of communication depended on this defense. For the Axis, breaking through El Alamein offered immense reward. It promised access to the Nile Valley and the Suez Canal. Such a victory would have threatened Allied positions across the Middle East. Oil supplies, sea routes, and imperial connections all hung in the balance. The consequences extended far beyond the desert battlefield. Strategic calculations in London and Berlin reflected this reality. Rommel understood the significance of the position immediately. His earlier successes had been achieved through mobility and surprise. At El Alamein, those advantages were constrained by terrain. Yet Rommel also recognized opportunity. A decisive breakthrough here could end the campaign in his favor. Speed remained essential before Allied strength could fully recover. British commanders reached similar conclusions from the opposite perspective. They saw El Alamein as the last defensible line before catastrophe. Retreat beyond it would have opened Egypt to invasion. There would be no space for withdrawal. No secondary line offered comparable protection. Failure at El Alamein meant strategic disaster. As Axis forces approached, preparations intensified. Defensive positions were strengthened. Minefields were laid across likely avenues of approach. Engineers worked relentlessly to shape the ground. Artillery positions were selected with care. Fields of fire were calculated to cover every approach. The British Eighth Army began transforming the corridor into a fortified zone. Depth replaced mobility as the central defensive principle. Time was used to prepare rather than maneuver. For soldiers arriving at El Alamein, the change was stark. The endless desert gave way to fixed lines and defined sectors. Movement was now governed by orders rather than opportunity. Rommel faced mounting challenges as he closed on the position. Supply lines stretched to their limits. Fuel shortages grew more severe with each mile advanced. Every additional day favored the defenders. Allied reinforcements continued to arrive. Material superiority slowly shifted. Despite this, Rommel pressed forward. He believed delay would prove fatal to Axis momentum. The gamble was characteristic of his command. Initial clashes revealed the nature of the new battlefield. Attacks met dense defensive fire. Progress came at high cost. The desert no longer rewarded bold thrusts alone. Preparation and coordination became decisive. Attrition replaced maneuver as the dominant form of combat. Both sides sensed the gravity of the moment. Veterans recognized that El Alamein was unlike previous engagements. The campaign had reached a turning point. Commanders adjusted their thinking. Expectations of rapid victory faded. The prospect of prolonged struggle loomed. For the Axis, El Alamein represented the final chance to exploit earlier gains. For the Allies, it was the line that must not be crossed. Neither side could afford failure. As forces assembled, tension mounted across the front. Patrols probed defensive lines. Artillery exchanges signaled the coming storm. The narrow corridor concentrated men and machines. Mistakes would have amplified consequences. Every decision carried strategic weight. In this confined space, the fate of the North African campaign would be decided. The Desert War had reached its limit. There would be no more room to maneuver. Only one position stood between Rommel and the Nile Valley. That position was El Alamein. El Alamein owed its importance not to size or population, but to geography. It lay on the narrow coastal strip of northern Egypt. Here, the open desert was constrained by natural barriers. To the north stretched the Mediterranean Sea. Its shoreline denied any possibility of maneuver around the flank. Naval movement offered no solution for land forces seeking to bypass defenses. To the south lay the Cairo Depression. This vast expanse of salt marsh, soft ground, and steep escarpments was impassable to mechanized forces. Attempts to cross it would have risked total destruction. Between sea and depression ran a corridor of desert barely wide enough for an army to operate. It was here that all movement, east or west, was forced to pass. The geography transformed the region into a natural bottleneck. For the first time in the North African campaign, maneuver was sharply limited. The freedom that had defined earlier fighting vanished. Any advance would have to confront prepared defenses head-on. El Alamein was not a fortress by design. It was a modest railway halt and collection of buildings, yet its location gave it strategic weight far beyond its physical appearance. Whoever held El Alamein controlled the gateway to Egypt. Beyond it lay the Nile Delta, the heart of British power in the region. Cairo, Alexandria, and vital lines of communication depended on this defense. For the Axis, breaking through El Alamein offered immense reward. It promised access to the Nile Valley and the Suez Canal. Such a victory would have threatened Allied positions across the Middle East. Oil supplies, sea routes, and imperial connections all hung in the balance. The consequences extended far beyond the desert battlefield. Strategic calculations in London and Berlin reflected this reality. Rommel understood the significance of the position immediately. His earlier successes had been achieved through mobility and surprise. At El Alamein, those advantages were constrained by terrain. Yet Rommel also recognized opportunity. A decisive breakthrough here could end the campaign in his favor. Speed remained essential before Allied strength could fully recover. British commanders reached similar conclusions from the opposite perspective. They saw El Alamein as the last defensible line before catastrophe. Retreat beyond it would have opened Egypt to invasion. There would be no space for withdrawal. No secondary line offered comparable protection. Failure at El Alamein meant strategic disaster. As Axis forces approached, preparations intensified. Defensive positions were strengthened. Minefields were laid across likely avenues of approach. Engineers worked relentlessly to shape the ground. Artillery positions were selected with care. Fields of fire were calculated to cover every approach. The British Eighth Army began transforming the corridor into a fortified zone. Depth replaced mobility as the central defensive principle. Time was used to prepare rather than maneuver. For soldiers arriving at El Alamein, the change was stark. The endless desert gave way to fixed lines and defined sectors. Movement was now governed by orders rather than opportunity. Rommel faced mounting challenges as he closed on the position. Supply lines stretched to their limits. Fuel shortages grew more severe with each mile advanced. Every additional day favored the defenders. Allied reinforcements continued to arrive. Material superiorities slowly shifted. Despite this, Rommel pressed. For he believed delay would prove fatal to Axis momentum. The gamble was characteristic of his command. Initial clashes revealed the nature of the new battlefield. Attacks met dense defensive fire. Progress came at high cost. The desert no longer rewarded bold thrusts alone. Preparation and coordination became decisive. Attrition replaced a maneuver as the dominant form of combat. Both sides sensed the gravity of the moment. Veterans recognized that El Alamein was unlike previous engagements. The campaign had reached a turning point. Commanders adjusted their thinking. Expectations of rapid victory faded. The prospect of prolonged struggle loomed. For the Axis, El Alamein represented the final chance to exploit earlier gains. For the Allies, it was the line that must not be crossed. Neither side could afford failure. As forces assembled, tension mounted across the front. Patrols probed defensive lines. Artillery exchanges signaled the coming storm. The narrow corridor concentrated men and machines. Mistakes would have amplified consequences. Every decision carried strategic weight. In this confined space, the fate of the North African campaign would be decided. The Desert War had reached its limit. There would be no more room to maneuver. Only one position stood between Rommel and the Nile Valley. That position was El Alamein. El Alamein was not a town of significance. It possessed no ancient walls, no grand architecture, and no political authority. It was a small railway halt on the Mediterranean coast. A modest stop along the coastal line linking Alexandria with the Western Desert. Its buildings were few, functional, and unremarkable. Before the war, El Alamein held little importance beyond transport and communication. Trains passed through, carrying goods, supplies, and passengers. Few could have imagined it would become the focal point of a continental struggle. Its importance lay in geography, not in what had been built there, but in where it stood. The land itself dictated its value. To the north was the sea. The Mediterranean formed a natural and absolute barrier. No army could move around it or maneuver. Beyond its edge, the coastline constrained movement to a narrow strip of land. Any force advancing east or west was forced to follow this corridor. Naval power alone could not substitute for control of the ground. To the south stretched the Cairo Depression, an impassable expanse of salt marsh and soft ground. This vast depression descended sharply below sea level. Its terrain swallowed vehicles and defeated engineering efforts. Salt flats, mud, and unstable surfaces made movement impossible for mechanized forces. Tracked vehicles risked becoming immobilized. Wheeled transport could not traverse the terrain at all. The Cairo Depression was not merely difficult ground. It was an absolute obstacle. Attempts to cross it would have led to isolation and destruction. Between them lay a narrow corridor of desert where neither army could outflank the other. This corridor funneled all military movement into a confined space. The wide-sweeping maneuvers of earlier desert fighting were no longer possible. For the first time in the Desert War, the battlefield imposed fixed limits. The freedom of open maneuver vanished. Commanders were denied the option of turning an enemy flank. Here, for the first time in the Desert War, both sides were forced into a direct confrontation. There would be no bypassing of defenses. There would be no escape through empty space. Every advance would have to meet resistance directly. Every withdrawal would be limited by geography. The desert ceased to be an ally of movement and became a cage. This transformation altered the nature of the campaign. Earlier engagements had been defined by speed and surprise. At El Alamein, preparation and endurance became decisive. The narrow corridor magnified the importance of defensive works. Minefields could block entire fronts. Artillery could cover all avenues of approach. Positions, once easily bypassed, now had to be reduced or broken. Time gained new importance. Delays favored the defender. For the Allies, this geography offered a final opportunity to halt the Axis advance. They could anchor their defense on natural barriers. They could concentrate forces without fear of encirclement. For the Axis, the corridor represented both opportunity and danger. A breakthrough promised access to Egypt's heartland. Failure risked exhaustion and collapse. Supply considerations became even more critical. The confined space limited dispersion. Congestion increased vulnerability to air and artillery attack. Commanders on both sides recognized the stakes immediately. El Alamein was not merely another position. It was the last gate before the Nile Valley. Beyond it lay Cairo, Alexandria, and the Suez Canal. Loss of these would have reshaped the entire strategic situation. The defense of El Alamein became synonymous with the defense of Egypt itself. Troops arriving at the front sensed the difference. The desert felt narrower, more constrained. The horizon no longer promised escape. Every movement was observed. Every concentration risked detection. The battlefield demanded discipline and coordination. The corridor forced armies to confront each other face to face. Strength would be measured not by maneuver alone, but by firepower and resolve. Endurance would decide what speed could not. As preparations intensified, the landscape dictated the coming battle. Engineers shaped defenses around natural obstacles. Commanders planned operations within strict limits. El Alamein became a line, drawn by the earth itself, a line that could not be bypassed. A line that would be held or broken only through direct struggle. What had been an unremarkable railway halt was transformed by circumstance. Its name would become known across the world. Its geography would decide the fate of armies. El Alamein was not important because of what stood upon it. It was important because nothing could go around it. The Desert War had reached the place where movement ended and decision began. In July 1942, Axis attacks against this line failed. The advance that had carried Axis forces across vast distances finally met an immovable barrier. Rommel launched repeated efforts to break through the El Alamein position. These attacks sought to regain momentum and exploit earlier successes. Each assault aimed to force a breach before Allied strength could fully recover. The fighting was intense and unrelenting. Axis units struck along multiple sectors of the front. Artillery fire and armoured thrusts tested British defences day after day. Yet the geography that had favoured Axis manoeuvre now worked against them. The narrow corridor limited flexibility. Opportunities for outflanking no longer existed. British defensive positions absorbed the shock of attack. Infantry held prepared ground under heavy fire. Artillery responded with concentrated barrages. Axis assaults achieved local gains, but failed to produce decisive results. Breakthroughs proved temporary. Counterattacks restored the line at critical moments. British forces held, but only just. Defensive success came at immense cost. Units were worn down by constant pressure and exhaustion. Casualties mounted steadily. Battalions were reduced to fractions of their original strength. Reserves were limited and often committed piecemeal. Supply shortages compounded the strain. Ammunition had to be rationed. Vehicles were kept running through improvisation rather than repair. The desert offered no relief. Heat, dust, and fatigue eroded endurance. Sleep came in brief and uncertain intervals. Morale fluctuated sharply. Confidence in the defensive line existed, but faith in leadership wavered. Many soldiers sensed that they were holding by determination alone. The Eighth Army was exhausted, shaken by defeat, and plagued by command instability. Previous reverses weighed heavily on officers and men alike. Memories of retreat remained fresh. Leadership changes had been frequent and disruptive. Commanders came and went without time to establish continuity. Orders were sometimes cautious, sometimes contradictory. Coordination between formations suffered as a result. Trust between command levels weakened. Operational clarity was often lacking. Despite individual acts of courage, the army struggled with cohesion. Defensive success masked deeper problems. The line held, but the force behind it was fragile. News of the fighting reached London quickly. Reports emphasized both the gravity of the situation and the narrow margin of survival. Strategic anxiety intensified. In London, confidence in the North African command collapsed. Political leaders questioned whether existing leadership could hold Egypt. Fear of disaster spread through senior circles. The stakes were understood clearly. Failure in Egypt would threaten the Suez Canal. Imperial communications and Middle Eastern stability were at risk. Public confidence depended on success abroad. Repeated defeats undermined morale at home. North Africa had become a measure of national resolve. Senior officials demanded decisive action. Incremental defense was no longer acceptable. A change in direction was required. Criticism focused on command effectiveness rather than troop quality. British soldiers had shown resilience under extreme conditions. What they lacked was consistent leadership and clear purpose. Discussions began regarding command reorganization. Candidates were evaluated for their ability to restore confidence and discipline. The emphasis shifted toward preparation rather than reaction. The July fighting served as a warning. El Alamein could be held, but not indefinitely without reform. Time alone would not solve underlying weaknesses. Axis failure to break through provided a brief respite, yet it also highlighted Allied vulnerability. Another assault might succeed if conditions remained unchanged. Both sides paused to reassess. For the Axis, the failure marked the limits of offensive momentum. For the Allies, it exposed the cost of disarray. The Desert Front entered a tense lull. Patrols replaced major assaults. Artillery exchanges continued sporadically. Behind the lines, preparations began for a new phase. Defenses were strengthened. Training intensified where possible. The Eighth Army awaited direction. Soldiers sensed that change was coming. The future of the campaign depended upon it. July 1942 had proven one truth beyond doubt. El Alamein could not be treated as another temporary position. It was the point at which the war would either be stabilized or lost. The line had held, but the margin was perilously thin. What followed would determine whether that line could endure. Change came in August. After weeks of strain and uncertainty, the direction of the North African campaign shifted. The catalyst was sudden and tragic. General William Gutt, the designated commander of the British Eighth Army, was killed when his aircraft was shot down en route to assume command. His death removed a respected officer, but also forced immediate reconsideration at the highest level. British leadership in Cairo and London faced an urgent decision. The Eighth Army stood at a critical defensive line. Delay or indecision risked catastrophe. After the death of General William Gutt in an air attack, Lieutenant General Bernard Montgomery was appointed commander of the British Eighth Army. The appointment represented a decisive break from recent patterns of command. It signaled an intention to restore authority and stability. Montgomery arrived with a clear mandate. He was expected not merely to hold the line, but to transform the army behind it. Confidence in incremental adjustment had vanished. Montgomery inherited an army that had lost faith in itself. Months of retreat had eroded belief in victory. Repeated changes in leadership had undermined trust. Many units had fought bravely yet felt misused. Orders had often emphasized withdrawal over resistance. The habit of retreat had become ingrained. Morale varied sharply across formations. Some units remained confident and disciplined. Others were exhausted and uncertain of their purpose. Montgomery assessed the situation rapidly. He toured the front lines and rear areas. He spoke directly with officers and enlisted men. What he found confirmed his initial judgment. The problem was not a lack of courage. It was a lack of clarity and confidence. Command structures had become reactive rather than decisive. Plans were frequently altered in response to enemy action. Initiative had been surrendered. Montgomery resolved to reverse this pattern immediately. He believed that psychological recovery was essential before any offensive action. His first priority was not attack, but recovery. Recovery began with the restoration of discipline. Orders were simplified and clarified. Responsibilities were clearly defined. Montgomery eliminated ambiguity wherever possible. He insisted that every unit understand its role. Confusion was treated as a failure of leadership. He also addressed morale directly. Speeches emphasized pride, resilience, and inevitability of success. The language of retreat was banished from command vocabulary. Montgomery made one promise above all others. There would be no more withdrawals. The army would stand and fight where it was positioned. This declaration had immediate effect. Soldiers understood that the uncertainty of constant retreat was over. Defensive positions were now final, not temporary. Training became a central focus. Units rehearsed their tasks repeatedly. Coordination between infantry, armor, artillery, and air support was emphasized. Montgomery demanded preparation rather than improvisation. Plans were to be detailed, rehearsed, and understood at every level. Surprise would come from execution, not haste. He also reshaped command culture. Initiative was encouraged within clear. Boundaries, discipline, and confidence were to coexist. Senior officers were evaluated rigorously. Those unable to adapt were replaced. Consistency of leadership was restored. Logistics received renewed attention. Supplies were stockpiled deliberately. Shortages were addressed systematically rather than reactively. Montgomery understood that. Confidence grew from material readiness. An army that lacked equipment could not believe in success. Preparation reinforced morale as much as rhetoric. Defensive positions at El Alamein were strengthened further. Minefields were expanded. Artillery. Positions were carefully surveyed and registered. The army was encouraged to see defense not as weakness, but as deliberate choice. Holding ground was framed as an act of control. Patience became a strategic virtue. Montgomery resisted pressure for immediate action. He rejected premature offensives. Time was to be used to rebuild strength. This approach contrasted sharply with previous command decisions. Earlier leadership had often been driven by urgency. Montgomery imposed deliberate calm. Communication between headquarters and frontline units improved. Orders were direct and consistent. Trust slowly began to return. The army responded to the change. Confidence grew as routines stabilized. Discipline replaced anxiety. Soldiers began to believe that their leaders understood the battlefield. They sensed that a coherent plan was forming. Purpose replaced uncertainty. Change came not through dramatic action, but through methodical restoration. Montgomery rebuilt the Eighth Army from within. Psychological recovery preceded operational ambition. By the end of August, The atmosphere had shifted. The army no longer felt like a force awaiting defeat. It had become a force preparing for decision. The transformation was incomplete but unmistakable. Foundations had been laid for future action. Confidence, once lost, had begun to return. The battle for El Alamein had not yet begun in full, but the struggle for control of the army had already. Then what followed would test whether recovery could be converted into victory. Montgomery halted all thoughts of retreat. With this decision, the cycle of withdrawal that had defined the campaign was brought to an end. For months, retreat had shaped the mindset of the Eighth Army. Each defensive position had been regarded as temporary. This expectation weakened resolve and undermined confidence. Montgomery understood that retreat was not only a physical movement, but a psychological condition. An army that expected to fall back could never fully commit to holding ground. Breaking this pattern became his first decisive act. He dismissed pessimism, enforced discipline, and restored confidence. Defeatist language was removed from orders and briefings. Expressions of doubt were addressed directly rather than tolerated. Montgomery insisted that confidence was not optional. He regarded morale as a command responsibility. Leadership was measured by clarity and conviction. Discipline became the foundation of recovery. Standards were enforced consistently across all units. Rules applied equally regardless of rank or reputation. Montgomery believed discipline created trust. Soldiers who knew what was expected could focus on execution. Order replaced uncertainty. He simplified plans, standardized training, and focused relentlessly on preparation. Complex and improvised schemes were rejected. Every operation was reduced to clear and achievable tasks. Training emphasized repetition rather than improvisation. Units rehearsed their roles until actions became instinctive. Coordination was built through routine rather than inspiration. Standardization removed confusion. Procedures were unified across formations. Units trained to operate together using shared methods. Montgomery viewed preparation as a form of protection. An army that was ready was less likely to panic. Confidence grew from familiarity and competence. He rejected haste in favor of readiness. Time was treated as an asset rather than an enemy. Every day of preparation strengthened the force. Planning extended beyond tactics. Logistics, communication, and medical support were integrated into every scheme. No operation was approved without full consideration of sustainment. Montgomery demanded that commanders understand their plans completely. Orders were expected to be clear and concise. Ambiguity was considered unacceptable. He personally reviewed operational concepts. Questions were encouraged until clarity was achieved. Once decisions were made, they were not revisited lightly. This approach contrasted sharply with earlier practices. Previously, plans had often changed in response to enemy action. Montgomery imposed stability of intent. He emphasized that preparation reduced fear. A soldier who knew his task was less likely to hesitate. Confidence replaced improvisation. Montgomery also focused on restoring pride. He reminded the army of its past achievements. Failure was framed as experience rather than weakness. He encouraged belief in eventual victory, not through optimism alone, but through visible readiness. Equipment improvements reinforced this message. He told his soldiers there would be no more withdrawals. This statement was deliberate and unequivocal. It removed all ambiguity about intent. The declaration carried significant risk. It eliminated the psychological safety of retreat, but it also removed doubt. Soldiers understood that the line they held mattered. Positions were no longer provisional, they were final. Asterisk, asterisk, this clarity altered behavior immediately. Defensive works were strengthened with renewed determination. Positions were improved rather than prepared for abandonment. Officers planned with the expectation of holding ground. Fire plans were refined. Counterattack schemes were rehearsed. They would fight where they stood. This principle became central to the army's identity. It replaced uncertainty with resolve. Montgomery believed that commitment to ground created moral strength. An army that stood firm denied the enemy momentum. Holding ground became an act of control rather than desperation. He reinforced this belief. Through example, visits to the front demonstrated confidence. His presence signaled permanence. Communication reinforced intent at every level. Orders were repeated until universally understood. The message did not change. The end of retreat transformed. Operational thinking. Defensive positions became deliberate choices. Each line was prepared for sustained resistance. Soldiers adjusted to the new reality. Fear of sudden withdrawal faded. A sense of purpose replaced anxiety. This transformation did not occur overnight. Doubt lingered among those shaped by earlier defeats, yet consistency gradually overcame hesitation. Montgomery maintained pressure on leadership standards. Officers were held accountable for discipline and clarity. Indecision was corrected swiftly. Preparation continued relentlessly. Training exercises simulated expected conditions. Rehearsal replaced improvisation. Confidence grew through competence. Units learned to trust themselves and each other. The army began to recover its identity. By removing retreat from consideration, Montgomery simplified decision-making. Every action was oriented toward holding and then advancing. The defensive phase became purposeful rather than passive. The enemy sensed the change. Allied positions no longer yielded easily. Resistance stiffened across the front. Montgomery's approach reshaped the moral balance of the campaign. The Axis advance encountered a force that no longer expected defeat. Momentum began to slow. This shift marked a turning point in leadership. Philosophy, preparation replaced reaction. Resolve replaced doubt. Montgomery had not yet launched an offensive, but he had already altered the course of the war. The army was no longer retreating. It was standing, preparing, and waiting. Waiting not in fear, but in confidence. Waiting for the moment to act. Throughout late summer and early autumn, the balance of power shifted. The change was gradual but unmistakable. After months of instability, conditions began to favor the Allies. The pause following the July fighting created an opportunity for reorganization. Time became a strategic asset rather than a liability. Allied reinforcements poured into Egypt. Men, machines, and supplies arrived in a steady and expanding flow. Ports, railways, and depots worked at maximum capacity. Alexandria and other key facilities became centers of continuous activity. Ships unloaded day and night. Crates of equipment were moved inland with urgency. The scale of reinforcement surpassed anything previously seen in the campaign. Entire units arrived fully equipped. Losses suffered earlier in the year were steadily replaced. New tanks, artillery, and aircraft arrived in growing numbers, many supplied by the United States. Industrial output from across the Atlantic began to assert its influence. Material strength translated directly into operational confidence. Armored formations received modern tanks capable of matching Axis equipment. Reliability and quantity compensated for earlier disadvantages. Maintenance units were expanded to sustain prolonged operations. Artillery strength increased dramatically. New guns extended range and improved accuracy. Ammunition stockpiles grew to levels previously unimaginable. Air power expanded alongside ground forces. New aircraft filled forward airfields. Pilots trained intensively to integrate with ground operations. Air superiority gradually shifted. Axis movements were increasingly observed and disrupted. Supply routes came under constant pressure from the air. The influx of equipment allowed for systematic training. Crews learned to operate new weapons with confidence. Exercises emphasized coordination rather than improvisation. Allied commanders could now plan without immediate fear of shortage. Operational concepts expanded accordingly. Preparation replaced urgency. Logistics became a strength rather than a constraint. Supply lines were shorter and more secure. Infrastructure improvements ensured steady flow to the front. The psychological effect of reinforcement was profound. Soldiers saw tangible evidence of support. Confidence grew with each delivery. Morale improved as equipment replaced worn and damaged. Vehicles, units regained full strength. The army felt increasingly capable of sustained combat. Axis forces, by contrast, struggled to replace losses. Attrition steadily eroded their fighting power. Every casualty carried greater weight. German and Italian units remained committed and experienced, yet their numbers declined. Equipment losses proved difficult to recover. The Axis logistical situation deteriorated steadily. Distance and interdiction combined to restrict supply. Each convoy faced growing danger. Their supply lines across the Mediterranean were under constant attack, and promised reinforcements often failed to arrive. Naval losses translated directly into shortages at the front. Fuel became increasingly scarce. Ships carrying tanks, vehicles, and ammunition were sunk or damaged. Surviving cargoes arrived late or incomplete. Planning became uncertain and reactive. Axis commanders were forced to ration resources. Fuel allocations limited maneuver. Artillery fire was carefully conserved. Maintenance suffered as spare parts became unavailable. Damaged vehicles were cannibalized to keep others running. Operational readiness declined steadily. The imbalance widened with each passing week. Allied strength increased while Axis capability diminished. Momentum shifted without major battles being fought. Rommel understood the implications clearly. Delay favored his opponent. Time worked against his position. Axis morale remained resilient but strained. Soldiers fought on despite growing shortages. Confidence was sustained through discipline rather than material support. Italian formations were particularly affected by supply limitations. Equipment losses could not be replaced quickly. Dependence on German support increased. Coordination between Axis allies became more difficult. Competition for scarce resources intensified. Operational cohesion suffered. The strategic picture changed. Accordingly, Allied planners gained freedom of action. Axis commanders faced narrowing options. Defensive preparations at El Alamein benefited from Allied strength. Positions were reinforced with ample resources. Depth and redundancy were now possible. For the Axis, offensive ambition faded. Holding ground became increasingly difficult. Flexibility was reduced by lack of fuel and equipment. Air superiority further compounded Axis difficulties. Convoys were spotted and attacked. Movement by day became hazardous. The Mediterranean, once a contested lifeline, became a dangerous corridor. Control of the sea increasingly favored the Allies. Every loss at sea echoed across the desert front. By early autumn, the contrast was stark. One side prepared deliberately for decisive action. The other struggled to maintain existing strength. The balance of power no longer rested on maneuver alone. Industrial capacity and logistics asserted dominance. The nature of the campaign evolved. For the Allies, patience was rewarded. Preparation accumulated quietly. Strength gathered behind the line. For the Axis, urgency increased, options narrowed, opportunities faded. The shifting balance set the conditions for what was to come. A decisive confrontation became inevitable. The outcome would be shaped long before the first shot was fired. Throughout late summer and early autumn, the Desert War entered a new phase, one defined not by movement, but by preparation and imbalance. The tide was turning. Montgomery understood. That victory would not come through speed or improvisation. His assessment was shaped by months of observation and experience in the Desert War. Earlier campaigns had demonstrated the limits of rapid maneuver. Bold advances had produced dramatic results, but none had proven decisive. Momentum gained through speed alone had always faded. Montgomery concluded that the enemy could not be defeated by chasing opportunity. Rommel thrived on fluid situations and rapid reaction. Meeting him on those terms would invite renewed reversals. Instead, Montgomery sought to impose his own method upon the battlefield. He believed that control, preparation, and certainty would outweigh daring. The initiative would be seized through planning rather than impulse. It would come through methodical destruction. This concept defined Montgomery's entire approach to the coming battle. The enemy would be worn down systematically rather than surprised suddenly. Methodical destruction meant breaking the Axis army piece by piece, not through dramatic breakthroughs, but through cumulative loss. Strength would be eroded until resistance collapsed. Montgomery aimed to destroy infantry, armor, artillery, and morale together. No single blow would decide the outcome. Victory would emerge from sustained pressure applied across time. Artillery became central to this vision. Firepower would replace maneuver as the primary weapon. Guns would shape the battlefield before infantry and armor advanced. Every target was to be identified in advance. Fire plans were calculated with precision. Coordination replaced spontaneity. Montgomery rejected the idea of exploiting chance. He believed chance favored the better prepared force. Preparation itself became the decisive advantage. His plan, codenamed Operation Lightfoot, aimed to break the Axis army through overwhelming firepower and sustained pressure. The name reflected a specific tactical concept. Infantry would advance on foot through minefields, while heavier forces followed. The Axis defensive system relied heavily on extensive mine belts. These minefields protected infantry positions and canalized movement. Breaking them was essential to any advance. Operation Lightfoot recognized this reality. Infantry and engineers would move ahead of armor. Their lighter weight reduced the risk of detonating pressure mines. Engineers would clear narrow lanes through the minefields. These corridors would allow armor to pass once secured. The process required time, discipline, and coordination. Montgomery accepted that progress would be slow. Speed was deliberately sacrificed. For control, each phase of the operation was designed to build upon the last. Artillery would support every stage. Barrage fire would suppress defenders and disrupt counterattacks. Fire would be continuous rather than concentrated in a single moment. Air power was integrated into the plan. Aircraft would strike rear areas and communication routes. Enemy movement would be constrained day and night. Montgomery emphasized attrition over penetration. The objective was not immediate breakthrough. It was the steady reduction of Axis combat power. Enemy armor was to be drawn into battle under unfavorable conditions. Anti-tank guns and artillery would engage them. Losses would accumulate without decisive Axis gain. Operation Lightfoot was not intended to be spectacular. It was designed to be relentless. Pressure would be maintained until resistance failed. The plan required exceptional discipline. Units had to adhere strictly to their objectives. Unauthorized advances were discouraged. Montgomery insisted that no exploitation occur until conditions were prepared. Premature pursuit risked chaos. Order was to be preserved above all else. Preparation for Operation Lightfoot was extensive. Training emphasized exact execution. Rehearsals were conducted repeatedly. Commanders memorized their roles. Subordinate units understood the wider plan. Clarity was enforced at every level. Artillery observers were positioned to respond immediately. Fire plans targeted likely approach routes. Concentration of fire replaced maneuver. Axis tanks advancing to counterattack would be met by prepared defenses. Momentum would be broken before it could develop. Losses would accumulate rapidly. Air power contributed to containment. Aircraft struck moving columns and supply routes. Axis reserves were disrupted before reaching the front. Coordination between ground and air forces was emphasized. Every arm supported the others. Isolation of enemy units became routine. Montgomery sought to deny the enemy freedom of action. Improvisation was constrained. Reaction replaced initiative. Any Axis counterattack carried heavy risk. Failure would weaken already strained resources. Success would be temporary at best. Defensive positioning transformed Allied strength into advantage. Prepared lines absorbed shock. Reserves responded calmly rather than urgently. The plan demanded absolute discipline from commanders. Unauthorized advances were prohibited. Deviation threatened the entire structure. Each phase of the assault was linked deliberately to the next. There was no single decisive thrust. Pressure accumulated steadily. Resistance weakened through exhaustion and loss. Firepower replaced daring. Endurance replaced momentum. Montgomery's assault plan reflected his philosophy of war. Victory would be constructed rather than seized. Control would outweigh brilliance. The deliberate assault accepted the cost of time. Time reduced uncertainty. Certainty reduced risk. By shaping the battle in this way, Montgomery seized the initiative. The battlefield would unfold according to design. Outcome would become inevitable. The minefields would be breached. The counterattacks would fail. Axis strength would erode. Victory would come not through speed, but through methodical destruction. Deception played a crucial role. Montgomery regarded deception as an essential component of operational success. It was not an accessory to the plan, but a pillar of it. The enemy needed to be misled about both timing and direction. Surprise would be achieved through expectation rather than secrecy. Belief would be shaped long before the first shot was fired. Montgomery understood the enemy mindset. Axis commanders anticipated maneuver and counterattack. They expected a struggle for initiative rather than a fixed confrontation. To exploit these expectations, a comprehensive deception plan was developed. Its purpose was to distort enemy perception. Reality would be concealed beneath deliberate illusion. In the South, Montgomery constructed a dummy army of fake tanks, guns, and supply dumps. This effort was extensive and systematic. It was designed to appear convincing even under aerial observation. Wooden frames and canvas coverings were shaped to resemble armored vehicles. From the air, their silhouettes matched those of real tanks. Shadow and spacing were carefully considered. Dummy artillery positions were established nearby. False gun pits were dug into the desert floor. Tracks and vehicle marks were added deliberately. Supply dumps were constructed using empty crates and fuel cans. These were arranged in patterns typical of real logistical concentrations. Camouflage netting was applied inconsistently to enhance realism. The dummy army grew steadily over weeks. Its expansion suggested preparation for a major offensive. Activity increased at a deliberate pace. Roads in the southern sector showed growing traffic marks. Dust trails were created intentionally. Movement patterns suggested reinforcement and build-up. Engineers and labor units worked openly in daylight. Their visibility was intentional. The enemy was meant to see the activity. False radio traffic reinforced the illusion. Signal units transmitted messages consistent with offensive preparation. Traffic volume increased steadily. Call signs were reused deliberately. Message patterns mimicked those of real formations. Radio discipline was relaxed to suggest inexperience or urgency. Entire phantom units were given identities. Their communications followed plausible command structures. Operational chatter suggested imminent action. Axis signal intelligence intercepted this traffic. Analysis appeared to confirm aerial observations. Confidence in the deception grew. To further reinforce the illusion, real units in the south behaved conspicuously. Limited movement occurred during daylight hours. Positions were adjusted visibly. Meanwhile, real preparations in the north were concealed. Movements took place primarily at night. Strict camouflage discipline was enforced. Vehicles were hidden during daylight. Tracks were erased or diverted. Noise and dust were minimized. Supply dumps in the north were dispersed and concealed. Ammunition was stockpiled gradually. No sudden build-up was visible. Artillery was moved forward under cover of darkness. Gun pits were prepared silently. Positions blended into the terrain. The contrast between north and south was deliberate. The south appeared active and aggressive. The north appeared quiet and defensive. Axis commanders interpreted this pattern according to expectation. They believed the main attack would come from the south. This belief shaped their defensive posture. Reserves were oriented accordingly. Attention focused on the southern sector. The north was considered a secondary threat. This assumption influenced Axis planning. Counterattack forces were positioned to respond southward. Flexibility was reduced elsewhere. Montgomery exploited this rigidity. He allowed the deception to mature. No action was taken to correct enemy misunderstanding. The illusion was maintained until the last moment. Dummy tanks remained in place even as the real attack approached. Radio traffic continued unchanged. Axis reconnaissance flights reported consistent patterns. No sudden shift was detected. Confidence hardened into certainty. Axis commanders were convinced the main attack would come from the south. This conviction was reinforced repeatedly. Contradictory signs were dismissed. When the offensive finally began, the deception achieved its purpose. Enemy attention was misdirected. Response was delayed and fragmented. In reality, the decisive blow was prepared in the north. There, the strongest infantry formations were concentrated. Artillery density was greatest. The northern sector offered terrain suited to Montgomery's plan. Minefield layouts were understood in detail. Fire plans were refined meticulously. Axis defenses in the north were strong but less reinforced. Reserves were farther away. Reaction time was increased. When the attack was launched, surprise was psychological rather than tactical. The enemy was not unaware. They were misprepared. Axes. Commanders initially interpreted the northern assault as a diversion. They expected the main blow to follow in the south. This hesitation proved costly. ***, precious hours were lost. Reserves were not committed immediately. Momentum shifted decisively. The deception plan achieved more than misdirection. It undermined enemy confidence. Assumptions collapsed under pressure. As reality contradicted expectation, decision-making slowed. Orders were reconsidered. Initiative faltered. Montgomery's deception demonstrated strategic patience. Victory was shaped long before the battle began. The battlefield was conditioned through belief. The dummy army never fired a shot, yet its contribution was decisive. It fixed enemy attention in the wrong place. Deception amplified material superiority. It multiplied the effect of firepower. It reduced the cost of breakthrough. Montgomery viewed deception as a force multiplier. It required imagination, discipline, and restraint. Its success depended on consistency. At El Alamein, deception functioned exactly as intended. The enemy fought the battle they expected, not the one that unfolded. The northern assault struck a prepared but under-reinforced defense. Pressure was applied where resistance was weakest. Balance was disrupted irreversibly. In this way, illusion shaped reality. Belief determined deployment. Deployment determined outcome. Deception did not win the battle alone, but it ensured that the decisive blow landed where it mattered most. The Desert War turned on what the enemy believed. On the night of the 23rd of October 1942, the desert erupted. The stillness that had settled over El Alamein was shattered in an instant. Silence gave way to overwhelming violence. Across the entire front, Allied artillery opened fire. The opening barrage marked the beginning of Operation Lightfoot. It was the largest concentration of firepower yet seen in the Desert War. Hundreds of guns unleashed a thunderous barrage that lit the night sky and shook the earth. Field guns, medium guns, and heavy artillery fired in carefully planned sequence. The horizon flashed continuously with muzzle fire. Sound rolled across the desert in waves. Explosions merged into a single sustained roar. The ground trembled beneath the weight of fire. For Axis soldiers in their trenches, the effect was immediate and terrifying. Defensive positions were engulfed in blast and dust. Communication lines were severed within seconds. Shells fell with relentless precision. Pre-registered targets were struck repeatedly. Known strong points vanished beneath clouds of sand and smoke. The barrage was not random. It followed a detailed fire plan refined over weeks. Every gun had a specific task. Some batteries targeted infantry positions. Others focused on artillery and command posts. Rear areas were struck to disrupt movement and reinforcement. Counter-battery fire sought to silence Axis guns. Observation posts were deliberately suppressed. The defenders were blinded as well as battered. The night sky glowed orange and white. Flares and explosions illuminated the battlefield. Darkness, no. Longer offered concealment. For Allied troops waiting to advance, the barrage was both signal and reassurance. It demonstrated overwhelming support. Firepower promised protection. For minutes that seemed endless, shells crashed into Axis positions. Time lost meaning amid the noise and vibration. The bombardment felt continuous and unbroken, yet it was measured and controlled. Rates of fire varied according to schedule. The barrage advanced methodically across the defensive belts. Axis troops struggled to respond. Orders could not be heard. Movement became dangerous. Trenches collapsed under repeated impacts. Sand-filled dugouts. Men clung to the ground and waited. Despite the intensity, discipline held in many positions. Experienced soldiers endured the storm. Defensive systems were damaged but not destroyed. Montgomery did not expect the artillery to win the battle alone. Its purpose was preparation and suppression. The infantry would complete the task. As the guns paused, the sudden silence was almost shocking. Ears rang in the aftermath. Dust hung in the air. This pause was deliberate. It marked the transition from fire to movement. The next phase began immediately. Then, as the guns paused, infantry moved forward. Columns rose from their start lines. Men advanced into the darkness. They moved steadily and deliberately. Speed was secondary to cohesion. Every unit followed a rehearsed route. Engineers accompanied the leading waves. Mine detectors and probes were carried forward. The most dangerous work lay ahead. Infantry entered the outer minefields. They advanced cautiously. Each step was tested. The battlefield ahead was illuminated by burning debris and intermittent fire. Shadows shifted constantly. Orientation was difficult. Enemy fire resumed unevenly. Machine guns and mortar engaged advancing troops. Resistance stiffened where positions remained intact. Infantry units pressed on despite losses. Training replaced hesitation. Objectives were clear. Engineers began clearing lanes under fire. Markers were placed carefully. Every cleared path was precious. Casualties occurred immediately. Mine explosions. Tore gaps in advancing ranks. Medical teams moved forward as planned. Commanders maintained control through prearranged signals. Radio communication was limited. Discipline ensured cohesion. Behind the leading troops, artillery resumed firing. A creeping barrage followed the advance. Fire shielded movement. Axis defenders attempted to recover. Surviving officers organized resistance. Local counterattacks were launched. These efforts met prepared responses, supporting firebroker movement. Momentum remained with the attackers. The infantry advance was not dramatic. It was grinding and costly. Progress was measured in yards. Yet, the line moved forward. Gaps began to open in the defensive belts. The first minefield was being breached. Throughout the night, the pattern repeated. Fire, movement, clearance, consolidation. Each step reinforced the next. The noise never fully ceased. Artillery thundered intermittently. Small arms fire crackled across the front. The desert, long associated with silence and distance, became claustrophobic. Smoke reduced visibility. Explosions compressed space. For Axis troops, the night was disorienting. The scale of the assault became apparent. Pressure was everywhere at once. For Allied soldiers, the reality of battle replaced anticipation. Training gave way to experience. Fear was confronted directly. By the early hours of the morning, the battlefield was transformed. Defensive systems were disrupted. The battle had fully begun. The opening night achieved its purpose. The Axis line was engaged across its entire length. Reserves were fixed in place. Operation Lightfoot was underway. The methodical plan was unfolding as designed. There would be no sudden breakthrough. Instead, the battle would be decided through endurance, through firepower applied relentlessly, through pressure sustained without pause. The desert had erupted, and it would not fall silent again for many days. Engineers led the way, probing the sand for mines under fire. They advanced ahead of the infantry, fully aware that their task carried the highest risk. Every step into the minefields was an act of deliberate courage. Enemy fire fell intermittently across the cleared approaches. Machine guns swept likely routes. Mortar rounds burst overhead and among the working parties. Despite this, the engineers continued forward. Their progress was measured and methodical. Speed was sacrificed for survival. Many relied on bayonets rather than detectors, feeling for metal beneath the surface. The desert sand often interfered with mechanical equipment. Hands and simple tools became more reliable than machines. Bayonets were pushed gently into the ground at shallow angles. Resistance signaled danger. Each probe required patience and control. A single mistake could trigger an explosion. Pressure mines lay buried inches below the surface. Others were connected by tripwires hidden in the sand. Engineers worked crouched or prone. Their faces were close to the ground. Every movement was deliberate and restrained. Infantrymen followed closely behind. Their role was to protect the engineers while they worked. They scanned the darkness for movement and muzzle flashes. The minefields were dense and uneven. Some areas contained hundreds of mines. Others were deceptively sparse. Clearing teams moved in narrow files. Spacing was carefully maintained. Concentration was absolute. Casualties were heavy. Explosions tore through the silence without warning. Men were killed or wounded instantly. Those nearby pressed themselves into the sand. Work paused only briefly. Then it resumed. The loss of individuals did not halt the task. Replacement teams stepped forward. The lanes had to be cleared. Medical orderlies moved cautiously into the minefields. They followed cleared paths precisely. Wounded men were evacuated under fire. Progress was slow. In some sectors, advance was measured in minutes per yard. Time stretched under the strain of danger. Commanders resisted the urge to push faster. Pressure could lead to fatal errors. Discipline remained paramount. Despite losses, morale held. Training and preparation guided action. Men focused on immediate tasks. The darkness offered limited concealment. Flares periodically illuminated the ground. Shadows froze mid-movement. Engineers halted whenever light exposed their position. They waited, motionless, until darkness returned. Then continued. As lanes were cleared, markers were placed. Small lamps were positioned low to the ground. Their glow was faint but unmistakable. These lamps defined the safe paths forward. They guided infantry and later armored units. They represented survival. Each lamp marked a hard-won advance. Behind every light lay risk, loss, and endurance. The minefields slowly surrendered their hold. The cleared paths were narrow, often only wide enough for single-file movement. Congestion became a constant challenge. Traffic control teams regulated flow. Units waited patiently for their turn to move. Order prevented chaos. Behind the leading engineers, additional teams widened the lanes. They removed remaining threats. Redundancy ensured safety. Enemy fire continued throughout the night. Axis defenders understood the importance of the minefields. They fought to protect them. Artillery support responded to identified threats. Fire was called down on known positions. Suppression allowed work to continue. The mine clearance was not dramatic. It was exhausting and relentless. It demanded absolute focus. Every cleared meter reduced the power of the defensive system. Each lane weakened the Devil's Gardens. Attrition worked in the attacker's favor. By the early hours of the morning, multiple paths were open. They were fragile but usable. The way forward existed. The faint lamps glowing in the darkness marked more than routes. They marked progress achieved under fire. They marked the cost of advance. Behind them, infantry consolidated. Ahead of them, armor waited. The battle moved into its next phase. Behind them, infantry advanced toward key ridges that dominated the battlefield. These elevated features controlled observation and fields of fire. Possession of the high ground would shape the course of the fight. Units moved forward in darkness broken by fire. Formations lost cohesion as terrain and enemy resistance intervened. Control became difficult to maintain. Fighting was intense and confused. Orders were shouted, repeated, and often misunderstood. Visibility was limited to flashes of light and drifting smoke. Axis defenders resisted fiercely, firing from prepared positions. Machine guns opened from concealed emplacements. Mortar dropped rounds with deadly accuracy. Defensive fire was coordinated and disciplined. Fields of fire overlapped deliberately. Approaches had been carefully selected in advance. German and Italian infantry held their ground. They had endured the bombardment and now fought back. Experience hardened their resistance. Artillery and machine gun fire tore through advancing formations. Bursts cut down men in the open. Explosions shattered groups and scattered units. Platoons were reduced in minutes. Leadership casualties mounted rapidly. Command passed down the line. Infantry sought cover where none existed. The desert offered little protection. Men pressed into shallow depressions and shell holes. Movement became a series of short rushes. Fire and maneuver merged into survival. Progress was uneven and costly. Despite losses, pressure continued. Fresh units were fed into the line. Momentum was sustained deliberately. Artillery support adjusted continuously. Fire missions were shifted forward. Defensive positions were suppressed where identified. The battle fragmented into countless local actions. Small groups fought independently. Objectives were taken yard by yard. Some Axis positions were overrun. Others held stubbornly. Resistance varied by sector. Close combat erupted around strongpoints. Grenades and small arms decided outcomes. Trenches changed hands repeatedly. Communication faltered under fire. Runners replaced radios. Messages arrived, late or not at all. Commanders relied on intent rather than control. They trusted training and discipline. Units pushed forward whenever possible. The ridges loomed ahead. Silhouettes shifted against the burning horizon. Every advance drew fire. Axis artillery responded fiercely. Counter barrages struck assembly areas. Supply routes came under attack. Medical teams worked continuously. Casualties were evacuated under fire. The wounded accumulated rapidly. Fatigue set in quickly. The night stretched endlessly. Adrenaline replaced rest. Yet the pressure did not relent. The attack was sustained despite confusion and loss. Withdrawal was not considered. Montgomery's intent was clear. Continuous pressure would erode resistance. The enemy would be denied recovery. Infantry units regrouped and advanced again. Pauses were brief and purposeful. Momentum was maintained at all costs. Axis defenders began to feel the strain. Ammunition was consumed rapidly. Reserves were committed piecemeal. The defensive system absorbed punishment but weakened. Cohesion frayed under constant assault. Small gaps began to appear. By the early hours, some ridges were contested. Others remained firmly held. The outcome was still uncertain. The night battle did not deliver decision. It delivered attrition. Both sides paid heavily, but the pattern was established. Pressure would continue without pause. The methodical battle was unfolding as planned. In the south, Allied attacks served their purpose by fixing Axis reserves in place. These operations were limited in scope, but deliberate in intent. Their value lay in containment, rather than breakthrough. Demonstrations and probing attacks were launched along the southern sector. Infantry and armor engaged defensively prepared positions. Pressure was applied without expectation of decisive gain. Axis commanders interpreted these actions as the opening phase of a major offensive. This perception aligned with earlier intelligence. Assumptions were reinforced rather than questioned. German armored units were prevented from moving north to counter the main assault. Orders directed them to remain poised for southern engagement. Mobility was constrained by expectation rather than necessity. Fuel shortages further limited flexibility. Any large-scale redeployment carried risk. Caution prevailed. Italian armored formations were similarly fixed. They were positioned to respond southward. Commitment elsewhere was delayed. The southern fighting demanded attention. Artillery exchanges intensified. Local counterattacks were prepared and launched. Axis reserves were drawn into readiness rather than movement. Engines remained idling rather than advancing. Time was consumed without effect. This delay proved decisive. Hours passed while the northern battle intensified. Opportunities for rapid response narrowed. Allied commanders maintained pressure deliberately. No attempt was made to disengage suddenly. Continuity preserved the illusion. Southern units reported heavy resistance. Losses were accepted as part of the design. Containment justified. The cost. Axis headquarters interpreted the situation conservatively. They awaited confirmation before redeploying reserves. Confirmation never came. By the time the scale of the northern assault became clear, options were limited. Movement under fire was increasingly dangerous. Air attacks disrupted routes. The opportunity to strike decisively at the northern penetration had passed. Reserves arrived late or in fragments. Coordination suffered. Montgomery's deception had succeeded. Enemy belief dictated enemy action. Reality arrived too late. The battlefield was shaped by expectation as much as by firepower. Decisions made hours earlier could not be reversed quickly. Inertia replaced initiative. The southern attacks achieved their strategic purpose. They fixed the enemy in place. They denied freedom of maneuver. As a result, the northern assault gained critical time. Pressure accumulated without effective counterstroke. Momentum shifted irreversibly. What appeared to be secondary fighting proved central to success. Containment enabled breakthrough. Deception translated into advantage. The Axis army fought bravely across the front, but it fought the battle it expected, not the battle that unfolded. In this way, the southern sector shaped the outcome, by holding the enemy still, by ensuring the main effort went unanswered. As dawn broke on the 24th of October, Allied forces had secured limited but vital gains. The battlefield revealed the cost of the night's fighting. Smoke drifted across shattered ground. Positions taken in darkness were now exposed by daylight. Infantry consolidated shallow footholds. Engineers continued clearing and widening lanes. The advances were modest in distance. They were significant in effect. Ground had been taken and held. Several Axis units suffered severe losses, including Italian and German formations caught in the initial assault. Forward positions had been overrun or isolated. Survivors withdrew. Under pressure, Italian units in particular were heavily affected. Some formations were shattered. Command and cohesion were badly damaged. German infantry also sustained serious casualties. Prepared positions had absorbed the bombardment unevenly. Some defenses collapsed under combined fire and assault. Equipment losses compounded the human cost. Guns were destroyed or abandoned. Vehicles lay wrecked among the minefields. Axis command was further disrupted by the sudden death of Rommel's temporary replacement, leaving the army leaderless at a critical moment. General Georg Stumm was killed during the opening phase of the battle. His death occurred amid confusion and intense pressure. Without clear leadership, decision-making slowed. Orders were delayed or contradictory. Initiative faltered. At key moments, headquarters struggled to establish control. Communication lines were damaged. Situation reports were incomplete. Local commanders acted independently. Some counterattacks were launched prematurely. Others failed to materialize. The absence of a central authority was keenly felt. Coordination between German and Italian units weakened further. Unity of effort suffered. Rommel remained absent during the opening stages. His return was delayed by illness and distance. The vacuum could not be filled immediately. The timing of the leadership loss proved critical. The battle was entering its decisive phase. Rapid decisions were required. Allied commanders recognized the opportunity. Pressure was maintained without pause. Momentum was preserved. Artillery fire continued to pound known positions. Air attacks targeted movement and supply routes. Axis attempts to regroup met constant disruption. By mid-morning, the shape of the battle had become clearer. The Axis defensive line had been dented but not broken. The struggle was far from over, yet the psychological balance had shifted. The Allies had gained confidence. The defenders faced uncertainty. The loss of experienced leadership compounded material disadvantage. Recovery became more difficult. Options narrowed. For the Allies, the first day had achieved its purpose. The Axis line was engaged and strained. Reserves were committed unevenly. For the Axis, the opening blow had landed hard. Losses were severe. Control was fragile. As the sun climbed higher, both sides prepared for the next phase. The Battle of El Alamein had entered its decisive struggle. What followed would determine the fate of the Desert War. Rommel was still absent, recovering from illness in Europe. Exhaustion and prolonged strain had forced him away from the front at a critical time. His absence coincided with the opening of the Allied offensive. Command of the Axis forces had been delegated temporarily. Responsibility rested on a structure already under pressure. Continuity of leadership was fragile. When news of the attack reached him, the scale was immediately apparent. Reports described a massive artillery bombardment and sustained infantry assaults. The situation demanded his presence. When he was informed of the attack, he immediately returned to Africa. There was no hesitation. Every hour of delay increased risk. Travel arrangements were made with urgency. The journey itself consumed valuable time. Events at the front continued to unfold without his direction. During his absence, Axis forces fought under strain. Decisions were made with incomplete information. Coordination suffered further. By the time he arrived, the battle had already entered a new phase. The initial shock had passed. Positions had been lost and contested. The front line was no longer as it had been before the attack. Minefields had been breached in places. Allied forces were established inside the defensive system. Rommel assessed the situation rapidly. He recognized that the battle had shifted from prevention to containment. Opportunities for early counterstroke had diminished. Losses had already accumulated. Reserves were partially committed. Flexibility was reduced. Fuel and ammunition shortages limited options. Redeployment carried high risk. Air attacks constrained movement. Rommel faced a different battle than the one he might have shaped from the start. The initiative had passed to the enemy. Reaction replaced anticipation. He issued orders to stabilize the front. Defensive positions were reinforced where possible. Local counterattacks were prepared cautiously, yet the strategic balance had changed. Time now favored the Allies. Attrition worked against the Axis. Rommel understood the implications clearly. The battle would not be decided quickly. Endurance would determine the outcome. His return restored leadership, but could not reverse earlier losses. Decisions now carried heavier cost. Margins were thin. The Battle of El Alamein had moved beyond its opening phase. The struggle ahead would be prolonged and costly. The Desert War approached its decisive test. Axis counterattacks followed. They were launched with urgency and determination. The objective was to restore the integrity of the defensive line. German armor struck hard, supported by powerful anti-tank guns. Panzer units advanced in concentrated groups. Their movement was covered by direct fire weapons. Anti-tank guns were brought forward deliberately. They were positioned to dominate open approaches. Fields of fire overlapped with precision. Counterattacks focused on contested ridges and breached sectors. These features offered control of observation and movement. Their recovery was considered essential. The fighting around key ridges became savage and prolonged. Neither side yielded easily. Positions changed hands repeatedly. Artillery fire intensified on both sides. Shells fell continuously across narrow areas. The ground was churned into dust and debris. Tanks burned in the desert. Hit vehicles erupted into flame and smoke. Black columns rose and marked the battlefield. Crews fought until vehicles were disabled. Some escaped under fire. Others were trapped inside burning hulls. Anti-tank engagements were fought at close range. Guns fired until destroyed or overrun. Losses mounted rapidly. Infantry clung to shallow positions under relentless fire. The desert offered little protection. Foxholes were scraped quickly and deepened under fire. Machine guns raked exposed ground. Mortars burst overhead. Fragments filled the air. Units fought in isolation. Communication was intermittent. Command relied on initiative at small unit level. Resupply became hazardous. Ammunition ran low. Water was scarce. Medical evacuation was slow and dangerous. Casualties accumulated near the front. Aid was given under fire. Despite losses, pressure continued. Axis commanders sought decisive local success. Momentum was pursued aggressively. Allied defenders absorbed the attacks deliberately. Prepared positions reduced vulnerability. Artillery responded with rapid fire. Fire control and coordination proved. Decisive, counter-attacking armor was met by concentrated barrages. Advances stalled under heavy loss. Air attacks added to the destruction. Aircraft struck moving columns and assembly areas. Retreat became difficult. By day and by night, the struggle continued. No sector remained quiet. Fatigue spread through both armies. The desert became a graveyard of machines. Wreckage littered the approaches to the ridges. Smoke hung constantly over the battlefield. Neither side achieved a quick decision. The battle settled into attrition. Endurance replaced maneuver. The Axis counterattacks failed to restore the line. Losses further weakened armored strength. Options narrowed. The fighting around the ridges continued without pause. Men fought and died for small gains. The cost mounted relentlessly. Montgomery resisted the temptation to gamble. He refused to risk his advantage on uncertain opportunity. Caution was a deliberate choice rather than hesitation. Rather than chasing breakthroughs, he focused on attrition. The objective was the gradual destruction of enemy combat power. Time was allowed to work in his favor. Montgomery understood the imbalance of resources. The Allies could sustain losses, the Axis could not. Plans were shaped to exploit this reality. Pressure would be applied continuously. Relief would be denied to the defender. Axis forces were compelled to counterattack again and again, bleeding strength they could not replace. Each effort consumed fuel, ammunition, and trained crews. Every loss reduced future capability. German armored units fought with determination, but their numbers dwindled steadily. Replacements failed to arrive in sufficient quantity. Italian formations suffered similar attrition. Equipment losses were especially damaging. Recovery became increasingly difficult. Counterattacks were launched under unfavorable conditions. Prepared defenses absorbed the shock. Firepower inflicted disproportionate damage. Montgomery avoided premature exploitation. He did not pursue local success recklessly. Positions were consolidated before further movement. This approach frustrated some subordinates. Opportunities appeared flitting, but discipline was enforced. The broader strategy remained unchanged. Destruction of enemy strength took precedence over speed. Certainty outweighed drama. Allied artillery and air power struck relentlessly, disrupting supply lines and movement. Fire missions were called continuously. Targets were engaged day and night. Artillery pounded assembly areas and approach routes. Counter-battery fires silenced enemy guns. Mobility was steadily reduced. Air attacks intensified as the battle progressed. Aircraft struck convoys and rear depots. Fuel shortages worsened. Movement by daylight became increasingly hazardous. Axis units were forced to disperse. Coordination suffered. Supply lines were stretched. And vulnerably, losses at sea compounded difficulties on land. Frontline units felt the strain immediately. Ammunition rationing became necessary. Artillery fire was limited. Defensive capability declined. The cumulative effect of sustained attack was decisive. Axis forces fought bravely but grew weaker. Cohesion eroded. Morale suffered as losses mounted. Confidence gave way to endurance. Hope of decisive counterstroke faded. Montgomery maintained steady pressure. He did not deviate from his plan. Consistency became a weapon. The battlefield evolved into a contest of endurance. Every day favored the side with greater resources. The outcome grew increasingly predictable. By refusing to gamble, Montgomery preserved strength. By focusing on attrition, he shaped inevitability. Victory approached not through sudden collapse, but through exhaustion. Day by day, the balance tipped further. The cumulative effect of sustained pressure became unmistakable. Momentum shifted steadily toward the Allies. Each passing day reduced Axis freedom of action. Losses could not be replaced. Recovery became increasingly unlikely. Axis fuel shortages worsened. Deliveries failed to meet consumption. Reserves dwindled rapidly. Fuel rationing constrained every decision. Training movements were curtailed. Operational flexibility vanished. Armored units were forced to limit maneuver. Counterattacks became shorter and more cautious. Opportunities went unexploited. Vehicles were abandoned. Some ran dry during movement. Others were disabled and left behind. Wrecked trucks and tanks littered the desert. Repair crews lacked parts and fuel. Salvage replaced recovery. Units fought on at reduced strength. Battalions shrank to companies. Companies dwindled to platoons. Commanders adjusted plans to reflect reality. Defensive sectors were thinned. Gaps widened under pressure. Fatigue compounded material loss. Rest became impossible. Endurance was tested continuously. Allied forces maintained the initiative. Fresh units rotated forward. Momentum was sustained deliberately. Artillery superiority remained overwhelming. Fire missions were delivered without pause. Targets were engaged. Repeatedly, air power tightened its grip. Convoys were intercepted. Rear areas were struck relentlessly. Movement by daylight became almost impossible for the Axis. Camouflage and dispersion offered limited protection. Exposure invited destruction. Communication suffered as equipment failed. Coordination between units weakened. Command and control eroded. Morale declined steadily. Confidence was replaced by grim determination. Hope narrowed to survival. Italian formations bore heavy strain. Equipment shortages were acute. Defensive cohesion weakened. German units fought stubbornly. Discipline held under extreme conditions. But strength ebbed inexorably. Allied superiority in manpower and material became decisive. Reserves allowed, sustained. Pressure, losses were absorbed without loss of momentum. The industrial weight behind the Allied armies asserted itself. Supplies flowed steadily forward. Shortages were temporary rather than permanent. The contrast between the two sides sharpened daily. One grew stronger through accumulation, the other weaker through depletion. The battlefield reflected this imbalance. Allied lines advanced incrementally. Axes' positions contracted. What had begun as a contested struggle evolved into attrition. Endurance favored the better supplied force. The outcome grew increasingly clear. By the end of each day, the Axis position worsened. By the beginning of the next, options were fewer. The tipping point had passed. The Desert War entered its final stage, not defined by sudden collapse, but by the steady exhaustion of resistance. In early November, Montgomery launched a renewed assault. The timing reflected careful calculation rather than urgency. Enemy strength had been worn down deliberately. The attack was concentrated and focused. Fresh units were committed at decisive points. Firepower was applied with overwhelming force. Artillery opened the way once again. Barrage fire shattered, weakened. Defenses, resistance was uneven and brittle. Axis defenses finally cracked. Positions that had held for days gave way. Cohesion collapsed under sustained pressure. Infantry broke through exhausted lines. Armored units advanced into widening gaps. Control slipped from Axis commanders. Attempts to stabilize the front failed. Reserves were insufficient. Fuel shortages limited movement. Rommel recognized the danger immediately. The prospect of encirclement became real. Survival of the army took precedence over ground. Rommel ordered a withdrawal. The decision was taken under extreme pressure. It marked the end of organized resistance at El Alamein. Initially, the retreat was conducted with discipline. Rear guards fought delaying actions. Routes westward were contested. However, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Communication broke down. Units became separated. The retreat soon became a general collapse, pursued relentlessly across the desert. Allied armor pressed forward aggressively. Air power harassed every movement. Axis columns were attacked by day and night. Vehicles were abandoned for lack of fuel. Wreckage lined the roads westward. Rearguards were overwhelmed. Defensive stands bought time but at heavy cost. Momentum favored the pursuers. Italian units suffered particularly severe losses. Some formations disintegrated entirely. Prisoners were taken in large numbers. German units attempted to maintain order. Discipline slowed the collapse. But exhaustion and shortage took their toll. Allied forces advanced methodically. Supply followed closely behind. Pressure never eased. The desert that had once enabled maneuver now offered no refuge. Open ground exposed retreating columns. Air superiority proved decisive. Rommel's army fell back toward Libya. Each day reduced its fighting strength. Recovery became impossible. The pursuit confirmed the outcome of the battle. El Alamein had been lost decisively. The Axis position in North Africa was broken. What followed was no longer a contest for ground. It was a struggle for survival. The Desert War had turned irrevocably. The Battle of El Alamein was over. The fighting that had raged across the desert finally subsided. A decisive outcome had been achieved. For the first time, a German field army had been decisively defeated on land by Western Allied forces. The victory carried significance far beyond the desert battlefield. It marked a turning point in the wider war. The myth of German invincibility was broken. Confidence shifted decisively toward the Allies. Momentum passed into new hands. The Axis threat to Egypt and the Middle East was ended. The Suez Canal was secured. Vital supply routes remained firmly under Allied control. Plans for deeper Axis penetration into the region collapsed. Strategic ambitions were curtailed permanently. The defensive struggle gave way to opportunity. North Africa was no longer a battleground of maneuver, but a theater of Allied advance. Initiative belonged to the pursuing armies. Retreat replaced counterattack. Axis forces fell back across Libya under constant pressure. Each withdrawal weakened their position further. Recovery became impossible. For the Allies, El Alamein represented more than victory. It validated preparation, discipline, and methodical warfare. It confirmed the effectiveness of unified command. Montgomery's strategy had succeeded as intended. Firepower and endurance proved decisive. Attrition overcame maneuver. The battle reshaped Allied confidence. It demonstrated that victory against experienced German forces was achievable. Belief translated into momentum. From this point forward, the direction of the North African campaign was clear. The Allies would advance westward. The Axis would fight a delaying struggle. El Alamein stood as a watershed. Not merely a battle won, but a war redirected. The desert, once contested endlessly, now lay open to pursuit. The road west was clear. The outcome of the North African War was no longer in doubt. El Alamein did not end the war. Fighting would continue. Across multiple continents, the conflict still demanded immense sacrifice, but it changed its direction. Momentum shifted decisively. Strategic initiative passed to the Allies, until El Alamein Allied efforts had largely been defensive. After it, offensive action became possible. Confidence replaced uncertainty. The victory altered expectations at every level. Commanders planned with greater assurance. Soldiers believed success was attainable, as Winston Churchill later observed. It marked not the beginning of the end, but the end of the beginning. The phrase captured the moment precisely. A long struggle had entered a new phase. The war would not be won quickly. Hard battles still lay ahead, but defeat was no longer inevitable. El Alamein demonstrated that preparation could overcome experience, that discipline could defeat daring, that methodical warfare could break a skilled enemy. For the Axis, the battle exposed irreversible weakness. Resources were insufficient for prolonged resistance. Strategic retreat became unavoidable. For the Allies, the battle confirmed the value of unity and coordination. Land, air, and logistics operated as one. Industrial strength translated into battlefield power. The desert bore silent witness to the change. Burned vehicles and shattered positions marked the cost. The landscape held the memory of struggle. In the dust and silence of the desert, the tide had turned. What followed would build upon that moment. The war had entered its decisive era.